What's up, everybody? Welcome to Conversations with me, your host, Jason Glaze. Thanks for tuning in. Hey, if you're watching this on YouTube, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Our analytics show that half of you watching, you're not subscribed yet. Do us a favor, subscribe. Also, drop a comment. That helps get this video in front of more people. If you're listening on iTunes or Spotify, welcome. Hey, you're going to love this conversation. My dear friend Scott Althauser is here. We just wrapped up part one of a conversation. Really, the best way to describe what we talked about is we use Scott's story to talk about how addiction and spirituality go hand in hand. It's probably the best way to sum up part one of this conversation. I really enjoyed it, and I know you will too. Thanks for being here. Scott Althauser.
Jason Glaze.
Thank you for coming.
It's good to see you again.
Yeah, man. I look forward to this.
Yeah, me too.
I miss you too.
I was thinking on the way here that it's going to be hard for me to resist the urge not to want to catch you up on like the last year or so, because it's been maybe roughly a year, let's say, maybe not. But so you had talked about maybe sharing stories from the past and things, and I thought, but there's so much stuff I want to catch you up on now. So you're going to have to help temper me.
All right.
If I try to jump from then to now.
Yeah.
Just let me know.
Will do.
All right.
Will do. Yeah. So the main reason I want to have you on is simply we have great conversations, don't we?
I agree.
Always have.
Yeah.
Like from the first time I met you, we're looking at 2003, 2004. I was teaching a conference. You were in a treatment center, no longer bound, getting sober.
Yeah, that's right.
And then I was teaching identity, concept of God, all this stuff. And you started getting some revelations of grace and identity. And I was honored to become almost like a mentor, teacher for you. And so we kind of played that role for a little while. And it was fascinating how the roles changed because not long after that, my alcoholism, which was so in the closet, right? Like nobody had a clue except for maybe my wife.
Yeah.
I had this closet alcoholism going, and you were on staff at No Longer Bound. And I remember walking in one day and you're like, hey, Jason's here to visit. And I'm like, no, Jason's not here to visit. My truck will not quit driving itself into the liquor store. I need help. Right. And so
I need a new truck.
Yeah, I need a new truck.
Yeah.
Truck's fault.
That's right.
So then you kind of headed up and formulated like a little outpatient program for me. And you led my inner healing class where really the theme of that class was I dealt with sexual shame.
Yeah.
Sexual shame is its own demon within itself.
Absolutely.
And that was kind of the theme of my inner healing. And you were this piece of conduit for my recovery and sobriety. So the roles flipped and you became that for me. And since then, I don't even know what year that was. My spatial memory's terrible.
Yeah, me too.
I can't tell you 6 months from 6 years. But I guess we're looking at probably 13, 14 years ago.
Yeah.
That was. And since then, we've kind of went back and forth on being that for each other.
Yeah.
There'll be seasons where you're kind of there for me as a piece of conduit. And there's seasons where I'm there for you. And it's been a really fun journey.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that you're probably on a very, very short list of people that I can say that that's actually happened to where those roles even can be flipped. You know what I mean? It seems like usually once you get locked into those, it's hard to break out of them, right? I mean, I'm sure you have people who have viewed you as a spiritual authority or, someone they admire, and it is tough to go back and forth. And I was nervous about it at the beginning, for sure. Like when you showed up and said, "Hey, I need some help," I was like, I don't think this is going to go over very well. Like I didn't know if you could view me that way. I didn't know if I could view me that way. I didn't know if I could even speak to you in those ways or look at you in those ways, just because I knew some of it would be tough. But I'm really grateful for it. Really grateful for it. I feel like. Yeah,
it wasn't difficult on my end. I was in so much pain. If you would have told me to go stand in the highway butt naked, I would have said yes, sir, and done it.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. Like I was in so much pain that I was just ready to take direction. So yeah, it wasn't difficult for me.
Yeah. Good. It was for me sometimes.
Was it?
Yeah, it was for me sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. You did very good at challenging me though, because like it had to be difficult because here I am a counselor. I know things, but my knowledge was absolutely useless.
Yeah.
Absolutely useless.
Well, plus some of the some of the part that I thought was going to be a little strange is using some of your same moves back at you, because you've also taught me so much about how to counsel, right? And how to push and how to challenge and when to let up. Not to mention just so many of the concepts that I still hold dear to this day, and just like, how do you drop a truth bomb on somebody who built the bomb? You know what I mean? Like, and there were a couple points maybe where, it got a little tense. I think I have a couple stories that I won't share, but where that whole analogy of I'll run out on the road naked got tested,
That's right. Yeah. I remember. I know what you're talking about.
One specifically. Yeah.
God, those days.
Yeah. But also to your point at the beginning about just kind of our relationship and stuff, I even listening to some of your podcasts lately and just hearing so much of what comes out of you and realizing that, like, man, there is a large percentage of not just who I am, but how I think and my self-talk and my concept of God and everything that came directly from you and from this ministry, but even more specifically from you, So I thought that was cool, kind of getting to hear you again through this podcast medium and be like, oh, that's what, A, we're brothers, and that feels good. And B, there's nobody I'd rather be more like. I mean, there's a few other people on that list. My dad is one of those people, which also feels good, by the way, to be at a stage in life where it's like, I want to be more like my own dad, and I want my children to be more like my own dad. But you're up there on that list of short people that if I, sometimes you'll that whole adage about if something is frustrating you about somebody else, it's probably because it's something in you, right? Or you're seeing something of yourself. But I think it works the other way too, to where I can see something of myself in you and really be grateful that whoever it came from, you, God, both, just be grateful for it. So
you're kind.
Yeah.
All right. So I've been so excited to record this with you because you're probably the best storyteller I know.
Oh yeah. Oh
hands
no.
Down.
I got to live up to it now.
And I love your journey, your spiritual journey, and how your spiritual journey and your addiction sobriety have kind of went hand in hand. Like, you've got a story that not many people have. Like, it wasn't like, and I think the reason I'm drawn to it, because I was kind of the same way, is like, in some parts of your addiction, you were chasing God at the same time. Like, when my alcoholism, the first few years of when it really got bad, me and Jesus were super close, and people don't understand that. People think if you've got a hidden drinking problem, then you and God have to be very distant, and that was not the case. It ended up feeling that way eventually, right?
Yeah.
But to see your spirituality and your addiction and how that journey has kind of been interwoven has always really fascinated me. Yeah. So I think I want to kick this conversation off by just kind of tell us your spiritual journey. Tell us that story.
Okay. You're going to have to help me though.
I will.
Because help me mostly with pace, Yeah. And if I'm going too in depth into one aspect of it, help pull me back in.
Gotcha.
I don't know what's going to be most interesting to you or to people listening to this.
Let's just kind of start out with your childhood religion, church experience.
Okay. All right. Some of this is going to be good for me too, because I just recently got done writing out my life story. And I've done this twice in my life. Once was when I was 21 and I arrived at this place called No Longer Bound that you mentioned. And the second time was 2 months ago. 'Cause we're subjecting ourselves to this process again too as a group. And we figured, I figured I might as well, we were going to do kind of the shortened version, where you just hit the bullet points. But I thought, if I'm going to do that, I'm just going to write the whole thing out again.
Oh, wow.
Didn't look at the first copy, which I still have somewhere. Didn't look at it. Just said, I'm just going to literally start from my very first memory and try to write out every single memory I have. I think this is a valuable exercise for any human being to do at least once in their life. But I decided to do it twice. And so it was way different. And I'll talk maybe later if we get to it about the differences between doing it the first time and doing it the second time. But it did have me going back and kind of remembering all of this stuff. So it's good timing. But maybe the place that I've thought of starting, I guess, is a little charismatic country church in the cornfields of rural Ohio.
Okay.
Right? Yeah. It's weird, right? Where there's a pastor who is also a farmer, full-time farmer, pastor, like missing fingers from having them caught in the combine, stuff like that, right? And just the most, rural, trying to think of words that aren't derogatory, just the most rural
country,
just country, cornfields of Ohio country, right? But super charismatic. So
gifts of the Spirit,
every time, every single service, right? No question. So, the service would basically consist of some praise and worship, followed by something later that I found out was called free worship, right? Which is just everybody's going crazy, right? People are just whatever they want to do. I mean, the instrumentalists are just, they got it tight to where they know the swells, right? But the worship leader lady was the wife of the pastor, and she'd just be singing in tongues, right? Singing whatever came to mind, and everybody's kind of dancing and hopping around, right? Again, pretty small setting though. And then usually after the free worship period, which was one of my favorite parts to watch, just fascinating.
Just for entertainment value?
Just for entertainment value. And plus I was just fascinated with it. I was just curious to know what's going on here, But then after the free worship, there would be a time where they would say, who's got the gift of prophecy? And then somebody would stand up and prophesy. They would say, all right, now there's going to be a time where somebody might stand up, say a bunch of stuff in what to me sounded like total baby babble, right? Couldn't understand a word of what they just said. And then they'd sit down and another person would stand up and translate what they just said.
Interpret.
Right? And interpret that tongue. And this is like every Sunday, any given Sunday.
So it was normal for
you. Totally normal. Yeah. And it was, it was the water I was swimming in. So to me, it was just absolutely normal. And it wasn't until maybe writing my story out the first time that I started to look back and think like, my family never participated in it. My parents would never participate in it. And it wasn't even a question. Like, I don't even remember ever asking, like, how come we don't join them? When they do this, we just all stand there and kind of watch, I don't know, but it was just super, super normal. So those sorts of gifts, seeing prophecies, seeing tongues, anointings, I can't remember people falling out too much, but those kinds of things were just part and parcel of going to church. It's what you do on a Sunday. Then right when you're done, you go eat the potluck and then you go home, and it's just, you do the rest of your day. So, so it's weird how like that kind of really exotic style of Christianity can also just can become mundane when you grow up in that, right? But it did plant some seeds around, I guess, the charismatic, more Pentecostal approach to things that really, they got stuck in there really deep as something that became a measuring stick, not only for whatever I considered real, true Christianity, powerful, empowered Christianity, but also became the measuring stick for my direct acceptance and connection to God.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
and that's the downside. Every denomination, movement, whatever, has a flip side.
Yeah.
And the charismatic movement, the Pentecostal movement, the gifts and all that, as a kid, that became your measuring stick of, does God approve of me? Do I have what it takes? Do I have these certain gifts, powers, strengths, and all that? Right?
I mean, they call them signs and seals and stuff, right? I mean, so you start attaching those words to it. Yeah. It's the signifier of your salvation, also of your acceptance, let's say. I'm not saying this is true. I'm just saying this is what I thought was true.
Now, how did this play out as you get into your teenage years?
So basically I became very obsessed with pursuing God in that way. I also became very rebellious, number one, and just started to become more increasingly isolated, increasingly rebellious, and increasingly addicted. Right. So my addiction started very young. I think I was drinking and smoking, cannabis when I was, I think, 7th grade. So by the time I hit late middle school to early high school, I was deep in that game. And so for me, my entire, formative years is just an oscillation between exaggerated religion and deep addiction. And then those two snakes or whatever, they did start to merge to where they became one and the same. And that's where things got really weird.
Talk about that.
Well, I mean, number one, I would say that, you mentioned alcohol and closeness with God not necessarily being impossible together.
In the beginning.
Right, especially. But again, I mean, I think for some reason when you were saying that, I was thinking about Carl Jung's quote kind of at the advent of the AA movement, which was that you show me an alcoholic and I'll show you somebody searching for God.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
And again, I think that's an aspect of addiction that people don't give enough credit to, that when you are watching somebody in addiction pursuing these altered states, they're pursuing heaven.
Absolutely.
Pursuing the good, the true, and the beautiful.
And peace for me.
And peace.
Oh, I was just chasing peace, which means I was chasing God.
And let's look at, we're already getting kind of deep into, let's say, what makes up a person, or whether we have needs on various levels, physical, soulical, spiritual. But if peace and presence are real needs or real expressions of spirit, then absolutely these things work.
Sure.
And they produce that. And they will feel, especially at first, it'll feel divine.
Yeah.
It'll feel like, finally, here's something that at least somewhat seems to align with whatever these scriptures have been saying, or whatever all these other people somehow can experience organically or whatever. I was never able to. I tried a lot of that stuff and just couldn't get it to work, Yeah. But then if you expand some of those maybe spiritual aspects out to include things like awe, things like purpose, things like adventure, these are some that I would throw on the list. Man, some of these substances work well. I think
that's a great point. I think in the beginning, yes, it was providing the peace, obviously false peace, but I was experiencing peace. So yeah. Toward the end, I was a prime example of self-medication. So if I got a hold of 6 Oxycontin, I would cut those suckers up into quarters.
Oh yeah.
And drip feed myself, right? To where a lot of addicts, if they get a hold of 4 oxys, they're going to pound 4 oxys, right? But no, I'm cutting them up into quarters and I'm drip feeding myself throughout the day. It was classic, just trying to medicate this brain, and just trying to medicate pain. So yeah.
If I got 6 oxys, especially back then, I would go all day in pain and then crush them all up and snort them at the same time at night, right? So I guess what I'm saying there is I could endure pain for the payoff. And the payoff for me was I wanted to be as deep into that other side that we were talking about, of peace, of presence, of play, of purpose, of awe, adventure, those sorts of things.
And the pain you're not talking about is not the physical pain people take oxys for.
Oh, no. Let's say that it was.
Mine wasn't. I stole mine.
Oh, no, of course. But I'm just saying, if there was any physical pain to medicate. But you're right. To your point, when you're talking self-medication, I would stay in emotional pain as long as I needed to. Because again, for me, the payoff was being pushed over a threshold into what I didn't realize at the time was my search for the spiritual realm, was my search for the spiritual life.
Absolutely.
And for God, right? And once I tasted that, it was the closest thing to that story I just got done telling about the free worship. For me, it was the closest thing to freedom I had ever felt too, and ever found. And the thing about those relationships to those, we can call them substances for now, is that they work so consistently.
Oh, every time.
They work every time. And some people would say until they don't, but I would just say, nah, they just keep working for me. I don't know. So that whole, we've talked about this plenty, but that whole adage about the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over, expecting a different result. I like to tell people I was expecting the same result every time, and I found something that actually worked. This is the opposite of insanity, right? Like actually trying to pursue it naturally with God, to where you are not in control of God, right? Yeah. And you cannot predict. This is not a formula here. Yeah. So you can't guarantee that if I do this and that and knock and seek and look, that it's gonna manifest. So for me, I wanted to go for something that I knew I could count on, and it was the most sane thing that I think I've ever done, is pursue God in a way that I could predict.
Here's the problem I ran into in my alcoholism, though, is yes, it worked every single time, but then the consequence the next day became so extreme. So I was a 3 days on, 4 days off, 4 days on, 3 days off. I didn't know at the time, but the mentor I never met, Brennan Manning, we had the exact same drinking pattern.
I was going to bring him up because you said closeness with God and alcohol.
Oh yeah.
And I was like, didn't Brennan drink?
For sure. I so relate to his story. So let's say I'm drinking for 3 days, and then that 4th day, you could not pour one down my throat. I could not. But then now what I get into is a cycle where I'm detoxing about every 3 or 4 days, right? So then I'm in the urgent care, right? So, one time with alcohol poisoning, but for the most time, it was what they now call anxiety, right? It was massive panic attacks, total dehydration. And I had a good system going. They would give me a banana bag and an Ativan. So the banana bag's an IV with all kind of potassium electrolytes.
Right.
And the Ativan, that's a benzo, right?
Yeah.
I walk out there a new man.
Yeah.
I'm like, I got a good gig going. And then the last time I went in there, the doctor said, Mr. Glaze, we're going to give you the banana bag, but we're not going to give you the Ativan. You need to feel this. And it was like God had his mouth going, you need to feel this.
Wow.
So yeah, even though, the drinking still worked every time, God, the consequence, I just couldn't handle anymore.
Sure.
It's just that pain was rough, bro.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, obviously the consequences stack up fairly quickly, but then they start to compound and get exponential, right? And that's where everyone talks about the downward spiral. Nobody talks about the upward spiral. Maybe we can get to that today too, because I think there is such a thing as a reciprocal narrowing and then a reciprocal opening, right? But yeah, that narrowing process, man, it's not even just the collateral of consequences, whether it be social consequences, relational, financial, physical, but it's also just the damn shame.
God.
I mean, the shame. And then, all of the symptoms of isolation and disconnection that come with it. And then those getting attributed to one's self too. And then just heaping burning coals on one's head. Right.
Oh man. Yeah.
So anyway,
All
we
right,
already got to
yeah.
maybe I should get back.
Yeah. So we're now kind of your teenage years. You're in your addiction.
Yeah.
And your addiction and your religion are kind of weaving in and out. And then you said they kind of meet.
Yeah. So, one thing that occurred to me thinking about telling some of these stories is that also I graduated from high school in 2002. So the advent of the internet it was a pretty brand new thing, going through Y2K and the turn of the millennium stuff. I know it sounds, but it was a pretty wild thing to realize. Like I remember actually realizing one day that I have access to all of this kind of information, right? And it took me down some weird roads. But before I get into that, maybe something else worth throwing in here is that I also had a back and forth relationship to school. So I'd go from public school to Christian school, and got taken out of public school because I was already at a pretty young age, like started smoking cigarettes and started messing around with things and getting in trouble quite a bit. So my parents lovingly moved me to a Christian school it was a very small private kindergarten through high school Christian school, one building, where I then finished out middle school and high school, right? And to me, again, that's important because I was simultaneously absorbing all of the intellectual and propositional content of Protestant Christianity, right? And then simultaneously living this entirely separate life that I would call a spiritual pursuit. Just in the wrong direction, but a spiritual pursuit nonetheless. And for me, I think it was probably even around freshman year where I thought, these two things don't have to be separate. Like for some reason, there was a very exciting and a very inspiring feeling that would come from learning all of these truths, right? These lowercase t truths, let's say, about God and about Christianity, about the Bible. And I loved it, man. I ate it up. And then also simultaneously leaving school, living a dark double life, knowingly going against everything that my parents had ever told me, everything that I was learning about, maybe about God or the Bible or whatever. But eventually, I started to really get obsessed with the book of Revelation, with John's apocalyptic trance, whatever this book is, right? I got obsessed with it. And
this was high school.
This was early high school.
Okay.
Yeah, early high school. So it started out pretty young. The way that it started, I don't know how many of the people listening to this are going to remember this, but there was you remember the Satanic Panic when maybe 80s and 90s when all the rock music was coming out and all the symbolism of occult symbolism was everywhere on these albums, and all of evangelical Christianity started to get uneasy about all this, and started to have protests and things like that. So I went through this pretty heavily, and it started to really create a chasm. We were just talking about the parable of Lazarus, but it started to create this chasm between the sacred and the secular, and the sacred started to get very, very small to me and very hard to access, and the secular started to get really big and also fascinating because there was so much. Really, we could say that back then, Christians were trying to to move away from this kind of content, but really there was also an obsession with it. So there was like a guy named Dave Munsey who would write these books about backmasking and occult symbolism in rock music and everything. I was obsessed with this guy. My whole family really was into this kind of thing. My brothers were too. But what it would lead to is my brothers and I would be obsessed with music, which I also, just to put a little disclaimer in here, I would also argue that music is approaching the divine. That's why every religion is a musical religion,
sure,
right? And Christianity, of course, has been a musical singing religion since the beginning. But so I think there's something divine in music itself. And I was also a musician. My dad's a musician. So it started to seem like there's just these two worlds. There's good music, which is evil, right? And then there's other music. I'll try not to be. And then there's other music that's, to me at the time, fairly boring.
Yeah, for sure.
Repetitive, boring, shallow, empty, all focused on abstract things that I couldn't relate to. So I guess trying to paint a picture here, my brothers and I could stay up all night with a literal record, winding it backwards to hear backwards messages in rock music, right? And then, the next day get up and go to church where there's that free worship going on, right? Where everybody's losing their minds, running around. But definitely things got pushed to extremes for me, right? And so the reason I kind of brought that up, and also, I would have to kind of smuggle in, let's say, a CD collection that eventually I would get caught with, and then we'd go out and we would burn all this in a burn barrel, right? And so I'd have to light it, watch it all burn.
Because you would get caught with it.
Because I get caught with it by my parents, and my parents would say, "Hey, this is evil stuff." It wasn't out of the ordinary to say this is demonic, right? Which again is a pretty intense thing to say to a young child like this. There are demons in this. Oh yeah, right. We need to go exorcise these demons by burning this now.
Yeah.
That'll
mess with your head.
I mean, yeah, right. Yeah. That like, wait, where are they? And what have I done? I mean, I really like this song right here, right? But am I opening the door for the demons? They're in our house now, and what does that say about me? Also, so that's a separate thing about my family dynamics. But I'm a middle child, and I didn't see any of my other brothers going down these roads, right? So again, as soon as I could step back and say, okay, there's something wrong with me, obviously, because I get excited by this stuff that apparently is demonic. Right.
So the whole time you got this going on, you're also obsessed with the book of Revelations.
Obsessed with the book of Revelation.
End time
stuff for sure. I just loved, well, first of all, I did get exposed to some pretty intense states of consciousness at a very young age too. Right. And as an adult, I've tried to appreciate that fact now that I have children, and to look at my young daughter and to say, within about a year from now, she could have one of, the most intense experiences that she might ever have in her whole life that she is not prepared for. Right. And that I just really started to pursue those experiences. And the connection to the book of Revelation, this is going to sound maybe controversial to people, but I had one of these visionary experiences at a very young age. And then I went to church and they preached from Revelation. And I thought, this sounds familiar to me. I recognize this kind of state, right? And so anyway, like I saw a lot of similarities between those two experiences and didn't have anyone really to process this stuff with. Maybe I could have, that's on me, but didn't think that I did. And there's an element just kind of embedded shame. So another detail I find kind of interesting now is during this time of growing up in the cornfields of Ohio, we lived in a parsonage. And a parsonage, for those that don't know, is they used to build a church and then they'd build a house for the pastor of the church. Yep. And so the pastor could be a full-time pastor and just live there and not have to, rent's free. You're the pastor. You live here. So we lived in a parsonage that was being rented out because the pastor didn't want to live there, right? So I literally grew up in the shadow of a Lutheran steeple. So this journey of taking my favorite, let's say, music, which again was my closest maybe access to the divine at the time, and take all this music that had maybe taken me this summer to kind of build up, and then having to carry it out to the burn barrel and light the match and watch it burn where, 20 feet from me, is a very ornate kind of traditional Lutheran church, right? That was just right next door. So whether I was any of the things that I was doing that was causing me shame at the time or causing me pain, I could just look out the window and see God just staring at me, right? Just literally a steeple judging me for many a year during really all of this kind of stuff. So it's a detail that I don't think I ever really acknowledged until these past couple months. I went through it again.
Oh, that's huge.
It's huge, right?
Huge.
It literally had not even occurred to me.
Yeah.
That you want to go outside and play or whatever. There's a church watching you. And every Sunday it would fill up with people. Sometimes Saturday, sometimes Wednesday nights. But we also didn't go to the church, which I found odd.
Yeah, you were going to the church in the cornfield. This was just a parsonage that the pastor didn't want to live in at another church.
Yeah. But it still struck me as odd even then that like, why are we driving 20 minutes? There's a church right here. What's wrong with these churches? You know? And again, that'll definitely take us down a different road in terms of that. But I found it odd that already there was built into my concept of Christianity, there was built in a separation and a fragmentation that like, no, I mean, we could literally walk next door, but we don't. And I didn't know why, right? And I wasn't into the theological reasons why. It's just that, no, we don't do that. We go to this other one where they hoop and they holler, right? And I used to watch through the windows of the Lutheran church just to see what the differences were. And there are many differences, right? It was different. So anyway, but I would look into the windows and watch and think, no, I actually do prefer the kind of experience that we're getting out here in the cornfields, probably because I just grew up in it and I got used to it. So to me, those kinds of extreme experiences were just literally what I pursued for years and years without really knowing why. I mean, it wasn't conscious until it started to be mixed with maybe more traditional recovery mentalities, because I would get busted and go to outpatient or get busted and go to jail or something. And then I started thinking, okay, this is a problem. I'm doing something wrong. I'm medicating somehow. But for the first many years, I was just pursuing these intense states, these intense experiences. And so when I made the connection of reading the book of Revelation after having one of these experiences and thought, oh, I can see the connection between these, I just got obsessed with reading it and all the interpretations of it. And, you know, there's names that I won't name, but I think we could all remember back to maybe some of the 80s and 90s. There was just a big kind of there was a big release of this kind of literature. Oh, yeah. Because the millennium's coming up, right? Yeah. The same thing happened in the first millennium from what I read.
And some of the guys writing it were serious, and some of them knew it was a moneymaker.
Sure. Yeah. But what's crazy is you can read the serious guys and go back and read them. Like, again, I want to say names, I'm not going to, but there's some popular books and authors that I'm sure people would remember from this age. Just recently, I found one of these books in the thrift store, the No Longer Bound thrift store in Dawsonville. It's right here, right behind us.
Yeah.
I found one of these books.
Really?
From a guy I won't name until we're off air. And it was from like 88. He was predicting 88. He had started out predicting 84.
84 was a big deal.
Yeah, 84 was a big deal, but then he had to modify a little bit once it didn't happen. Yeah. And this has been going on for a long time, by the way. So is the charismatic thing. That goes all the way back to the first century. We won't get into that right now. But you know, I picked up the book in the thrift store and I started reading it, and dang, I mean, so much of it was like, this stuff's spot on. Like, and it just makes a ton of sense, right? Like a lot of sense. So much so that it's like, what do we do with that now? Because it really seemed to be lining up with what was going on at the time. But of course, I fell into that trap.
Yeah.
And it's an old trap, but I fell into it and just got totally obsessed with interpreting the generations, you know, from Israel becoming a nation in 1942 and what a biblical generation is and how all these numbers and all these hidden codes, you know, there's a thing called the Bible code that had come out.
That. Yeah.
There's the Left Behind series.
Oh, yeah.
Right. That my whole family and all my peer group was into at the Christian school that I went to. And so again, it's something that like, I've looked at my story so much through the lens of the addiction side of things and so much through a negative lens of the addiction side of things that it's actually taken me quite a while to go back through from a gracious perspective to ask the positive question. What was I looking for? Right.
Yeah.
And what was I also absorbing? Because again, I bought into some of the lies that like, I was just like a discrete island individual who just like, I don't know, just woke up one day and wanted to be interested in all these things. But like there was a whole frenzy going on leading up to Y2K and all that.
Oh, yeah.
A whole end times frenzy that just got baked into me.
Yeah.
And I also think I'm sensitive in certain ways when it comes to that. And dude, I took that stuff very seriously from a young age. Like I actually made the mistake of, I'm saying this kind of tongue in cheek, but I made the mistake of actually believing these things, right? It's like so many of the things that we ascribe our belief to, or that we propose that we believe in these things. And then we say, okay, well, why aren't you selling all of your possessions, giving them to the poor? And it's like, well, I mean, that wasn't for me. Obviously that was for the rich man, and, but so many of those aspects of Christianity that I was getting exposed to, I took them very seriously. So I took heaven and hell very seriously and had a lot of questions about where the lines are and how fickle God is with his paperwork and what, what are the limits here? What are the rules here? But took it all very serious. Took evangelism very seriously. So again, if you look back at my childhood, it's going to be an oscillation between total isolation and just total evangelization. I just talked to my younger brother about this a couple days ago. We were talking about my daughter and how she's 10 and some of the questions she's having as it relates to God and reality. And my brother made the comment, yeah, by that age, I was already like full-blown evangelical, like actually evangelizing, like trying to save all my friends, right, and save them from hell. It's like, yeah, for me too, that started really, really young, And I just didn't know better that like, no, we're not supposed to spend every second of every day trying to save everybody and trying to figure out, is the world going to end tomorrow? Right. Are we saved? Am I safe? Stuff like that. So anyway, yeah, they started to merge. I don't know if you want to jump in here, but they started to merge in a way that eventually didn't do anything to curb my addiction, but these two streams started to feed into each other and make like, a Dead Sea or something, right? And man, once they merged, that's when I got strange. And that's when my friends started to distance themselves from me. That's when my family started to realize there was something really wrong with me. And then I found myself on a perpetual search to like crack these codes because I thought everything was riding on it, So it wasn't just pure excitement of interest or, dealing with dark things that kind of, I don't know what the word is here, but anyway, it was a sincere desire to figure this out, right? And let him who is wise learn the meaning of this number, right? And like of these signs, and let him who is wise look for these signs and be ready for these signs. So I thought, all right, the least I can do is take this part seriously. And it doesn't help the fact that this revelation of John's, this apocalyptic revelation, happens to be the last thing there is, right? I mean, if you were reading the Bible in an arc of a story, even though there's debate on whether it was the last book actually written, but we put it at the end. We put it at the end, yeah. And then at the end is like the culmination of all things. And then at the end of that says, don't let anything, any letter or word change or be written or added to this book, right. Which is referring to that, But the way that the arc, I'd gone through the Bible a couple times, read through the whole thing, and it's hard to deny that, like, the final act of any story is the climax of the story that then leads to resolution. Yeah. And for me, it was very obvious where the climax of the story was, right? Like, we're not trying to hide it. Yeah. You got the Gospels, you got the epistles, but then you've got the revelation of all things, right. So I thought, okay, that's the most important book there is. So talk to us about how all this anguish and pain and just mental obsession kind of finally led you to, or is this what finally led you to a breaking point where you actually got help and got sober? It did. It's like God, it's almost like a lot of the second half of my journey with God has been, or at least the middle part has been him using my idiosyncrasies for my sake, like using them for me. So if it was something like, I wouldn't have probably received something as fully real or fully from God unless it came through that charismatic kind of Pentecostal mode. And he met me there. I mean, he used some of those modes to break me, to get me to a point to, I guess, free me from needing and pursuing those modes, right? But yes, he did end up using one. So I got to the point, I had recruited a couple friends of mine that I was in high school with. Remember, this is a Christian school. I eventually got expelled from this school. But before I had gotten expelled from it, I had recruited some friends to kind of help me do this serious work, this research, right? Of all this end time stuff. And again, with the Left Behind series going around, it's not like I was the only one here.
Right.
Like it was in the water.
For sure.
Yeah. So it wasn't hard to recruit people, but
Right.
I would just go around and ask the questions. And so I got hooked up with a couple other friends who had this same kind of background and had the same kind of slant. And so I ended up going to a local church in Toledo, Ohio. There was a very prominent preacher who's still a very prominent preacher, kind of prophet preacher, right? One of those guys, who I won't say the name, but I guarantee most people will have heard of this person. And he came to this church in Toledo and I experienced one of the wildest nights I've ever seen, right? Just of charisma, right?
Were you sober?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So one thing I would make sure to do is I would not be high at church.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'd be high right after, right? Or the next morning, but not
Right.
during.
Right.
Not during.
Okay.
Because I was at least, I at least thought, hey, there are this sacred and secular thing. Sorry.
Right.
That I need to at least, if anything is going to happen to me, if I'm going to be able to receive anything, at least have to be like the baseline sober. Yeah. Which, that's a gray area.
Yeah.
But what I was searching for now I can look back and say what I was searching for is I was searching for a sign and a seal of acceptance, and that's it.
Yeah.
That's really all. Plus, I was drawn to these kind of extreme experiences. So, but this guy had one of these wild, prophetic nights where everybody's running around and he sees an angel up on the second balcony and the angel's telling him stuff that he should come back once a month for a year, and because there's going to be a revival in Toledo and stuff. And the idea of revival was big too, for some reason, in my area growing up. Obviously there's been plenty of revivals since then and stuff. And revival's an interesting one, but it was definitely one that I thought we should be desiring. And this guy is basically saying it's going to happen, and it's going to start here in this church in Toledo. And it's going to start, whoever's here, like you're witnessing the beginning of this. And I thought, oh, wow, this is great. It's like God is literally telling me, hey, you're in the right place, doing the right thing at the right time. Just maybe try to stay sober a little bit more, but other than that, you're pursuing the right things. And so, I went down to the altar for the first time and I said, all right, I think that I'm ready to receive this stuff. And nothing happened, right? It happened to everybody else around me, but nothing happened.
You're about
to me.
receiving the gifts,
Receiving the
baptism,
gifts,
the Holy Spirit, whatever we want to
whatever
call it.
that is. Now, for me at the time, I just thought I'm either going to fall down and that'll be nice, right? Or I'll start babbling and that'll be cool. But really, I wanted God or the Holy Spirit to just take me over. And if he could show me that he could take me over, I'm thinking this now out loud, but if he could show me that he could take me over as much as these other things can take me over, then I think the scales would tip, right? But up until now, I had seen it happen and I'd seen it take over everybody except me. It just never seemed to work with me. And it started out frustrating and then became condemning.
Yeah,
it became
shameful.
It became the sign and the seal of unacceptance, of rejection, right? Of shame, of just like, no, this random person next to you, sure. This random person next to you, great. But the one guy who thinks he's pursuing it and really, really wanting it and praying for it and begging for it, the answer is no, right? Not for you. So another maybe detail that's coming to mind here that might be interesting is that I did get to see kind of two sides of this charisma. One side was what I already described in the little cornfield country church. The other side of it was the most simple, basic, practical version of it, which is my dad. My dad would come into our room every night and put us to bed, and he would just whisper in his tongue in our ear. Always a whisper, always like the same, I guess you can call them sentences, the same few sentences that he'd whisper in our ear. And then sometimes he would pray over us, and sometimes there have been moments in my life where he would prophesy over me or over us. But it was always just the most mundane, practical, simple. It's my dad, right?
Sure.
Nothing spiritual. He wouldn't pray beforehand. It wouldn't be ceremonial. And so it seemed like somehow or another it could just flow out of him. He could just have access, right? Without any of the other stuff. But of course, I couldn't seem to tap into it that way. And so I figured the next best thing I could do is put myself in the environments when this stuff breaks out and to be there and be just ready and waiting on the sideline. So I started out with that once a month guy that would fly there. I went to every single one of those and I would look forward to them. And each one, the expectation was, please either use my desire for these gifts to teach me something about the imminent end of the world that I wouldn't have learned if I wasn't desiring these gifts. Meaning, so I was already starting to say, look, if you're not going to give me these gifts, fine.
At least use them to show me something.
Show me what I need to see, because you've put this desire in me to know. And again, it's written in the scriptures, right? Let he who is wise learn these things. So I thought I was taking it seriously. But of course, I'm not talking much right now about the double dark life that I had. There's plenty of pain, plenty of like this stuff still might have gone this way without all that, but it was definitely made much, much worse.
Sure.
I mean, psychosis was starting to form, right? You mentioned kind of anxiety and stuff, but like all these other factors that are fueling this stuff and intensifying it and making the need for it to happen even more imminent, or even more urgent rather. Now I also am realizing that I'm carrying these demons with me, right, or whatever, or that I've got these addictions with me. So now what started out maybe as a more innocent or honest pursuit now is also like, no, I need this to be free of that. And then it became like, hey, God, you need to free me from this stuff now, right? Like, yes, I've done it, but if you're as powerful as you say, and if there's freedom in these sorts of experiences, now I need you to use one of those, the real version of these experiences, to free me from these, because I can't get free from them otherwise. So then it became more of what started out maybe as a petition became like a plea, and then eventually became like maybe even a demand, like, you've got to do this for me. You've got to give me this thing. So it led me, what was initially a once a month thing in Toledo, Ohio, eventually led me to wanting to travel to go find this. So then I started paying attention and getting on calendars and websites where these people come, getting into different prophecy preachers and just following them around. One time I came all the way to Georgia for a camp meeting with this one person I won't name, and another prominent local pastor here, which kind of was ironic years later when I got to No Longer Bound and found out that's the home church that No Longer Bound goes to. But man, I was looking everywhere. So I'd drive with a couple friends of mine, and yes, we would use, like I said, before, after, not during, and then just find these experiences anywhere we could. Yeah.
And then walk us up to what finally led you to the breaking point where you ended up at No Longer Bound in recovery.
Well,
and then it's kind of for the point of, how did your concept of God and your concept of yourself and grace and all that, how did that begin to change?
Well, the road there, again, you helped me stay kind of in the middle of the road here, because it wasn't a quick process. For some people, it is a very quick process. There's a crisis, there's an intervention, and then I need to go get help.
Right.
For me, it was a gradual slope that led me to the bottom, mixed with some of these strange experiences. So I do remember a couple times where I traveled to rural Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky, places like that, following some of these people around. And I did come across one where I would say that I had a genuine prophetic experience where I was prophesied over. And basically No Longer Bound was prophesied to me. Not the words No Longer Bound, but what this individual spoke over me. One of the things that he spoke was that he sees an arrow of light or a fire starting from the north of the country, shooting down to the south of the country, and that there is deliverance for you down there in the south, and that wherever you go after that, you will sow your seed of deliverance. But there is this arrow of urgency that down in the south of the United States. And of course, I had no idea what to make of that. I mean, that made no sense to me whatsoever. But it was on the heels of two other prophecies that did make a lot of sense to me. So I held it in my heart, right? Because I was also there with a couple friends of mine, and they were in the row next to me. And so I got to watch these prophecy people, there were three of them, come one at a time and prophesy over my friends, and I got to hear it. And I knew that what they were saying to them, I was in shock, because I'm like, there's no way they should know these things. Like, I know these guys, but they don't. So the first lady came through and said, write it down. And she said that like 50 times. She just said, write it down, write it down, write it down, write it down. I would keep going, but your guy would have to edit it out. But literally she said, write it down 50 times. And that's all she said. And then she moved on. Whereas she had just done like a pretty elaborate prophecy with this other friend of mine who was standing right next to me. And I was like, oh, this is great. She's going to tell me some stuff. That's all she said.
Write it down.
Write it down. Write it down. Write it down. The next person comes by, again, prophesies over my two friends, so I get to hear it. I'm thinking, all right, this is going to be a good one. That lady basically says, you need to get alone with God. You need to get somewhere safe and alone so that God can come get you. She said many books will flow from you, both for the believer and the unbeliever, things like this. Again, pretty cool stuff. And then the third guy came around, did this flaming arrow from the north to the south or whatever. It made no sense to me. And I just kind of went home from there baffled, just totally like kind of in shock and bafflement. Whereas my two other friends, again, they got some practical value out of it. I think. I mean, I did. I got practical value out of theirs, none out of mine. I wanted to mention that one because that one really ended up taking shape for me when I was at No Longer Bound. Mm-hmm. I started to go back and be like, what were these things about, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas now I've got like a stack of journals, up to here that cover really the last 20 years of my life that I would say that was me writing it down, right? So what eventually started to happen towards the very end, I mentioned I got expelled from my high school. I had a long-term girlfriend that I had started dating in 8th grade who was going through addiction herself, and so was I. I graduated high school. I got sober. I had a dream, one of these God dreams. I think we've all probably had some of these dreams before where you wake up and you just know that was not a normal dream. Like it still sticks with me. I could still recall it and feel it. So I did the thing. I got really convicted. It was a dream of kind of the end of my life. And so I picked up a Bible that night. I started crying, started reading it, and just begged him. I tried to get sober for about a month leading up to this and couldn't, and begged him to deliver me from it, once and for all. And this is probably the first time I had ever asked him. It was just me and no hoopla, right? Wasn't looking for anything else other than, I don't want to die. I can't get free, and I'll do whatever you want, right? I'll do whatever you want. Just do this for me. And then he did. So the next day I woke up, didn't use. Day after that, didn't use. Went about 2 years sober. First time that I had ever been sober that long. First time I'd really ever even tried to get sober and realized that I couldn't, right? But what happened instead, like I said, I swung real far in the other direction and just became hyper religious. So I'm not saying any of these things are negative by themselves, but for me, they happen to be another form of addiction. But I would carry my Bible around with me everywhere at school, constantly reading it, debating with people all the time. Very legalistic approach, a performance-based approach towards God for sure, but at least for whatever reason was able to pull it off and felt like this is working, like this is actually working. And when that gave way, when that crumbled eventually and relapse happened, right, and the return to use just starts right where it left off, right, and then looking back and thinking, was any of this worth anything, right? Was any of it real? Was any of it God? How much of it was me? Then I just really started to be crushed, like finally crushed. And yeah, basically ended up really bad off living in my car, coming back and forth to Georgia, which is it's part of the story I don't know if we should get into, but ended up hearing about this place called No Longer Bound and thinking, you know what, this could be an opportunity for me. I mean, when I was at my best, I thought about it this way. I could go down there, sit under a tree, and finally eat the Bible, just eat the whole thing and ingest it and actually keep it in me this time.
Because you knew it was a year-long program.
I knew it was a year-long program. Yeah, which is terrifying.
Yeah.
But I thought, shoot, if nothing else, maybe now I would have time to really memorize the entire Bible or tattoo it all over my skin, right?
Because that'll fix it.
Because that'll help. I mean, that's it. And literally my whole life up until No Longer Bound, I lived beneath the Bible. I lived in bibliolatry, which is the worship of the Bible.
Worship of the Bible, yeah.
I actually thought that John 1:1 or whatever ended with the word became a book, a leather-bound book. And that's all there is. That's all you need. It is God in a book.
In the beginning was the Bible. The Bible was the word of God.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. And so, yeah. So anyway, but right before going there, we had a falling out. My family did an intervention. My girlfriend and I had one of those, vulnerable moments where we got honest with each other about everything and made some promises to each other and everything. And one of my oldest brother had been living down here in Georgia and said, hey, I heard about this place. You should consider coming to it. I fought it until literally the moment where I stepped foot on that. I fought it even after that, of course, but I fought it the whole way down. Didn't know for sure how I'd feel about this place. I was prepared to go in there and critique this place based on its Christianity, based on its theology. Exactly. Yeah. Right. So, I left a little bit of wiggle room at the beginning to be like, if these people are theologically unsound, probably not going to stay in this place, because that's what I'm here to get. Obviously, there's something wrong with my theology, and there's something wrong with my relationship to the Bible, and I need that to get fixed. So I need the right place to do that, because then the addiction, whatever, like, I don't know, it'll take care of itself, So, yeah. What next?
What happened? So you got down there.
Yeah. So I got down there, and man, there's so many versions, so many stories that I could tell. There's micro, there's macro.
Let's go macro for time's sake.
Yeah.
If you could give the macro of what God did for you in that year.
Well, I would say that number one, what he did for me is actually allow me. I want to say he started talking to me, but a better way to say it might be that I got in a position where I could hear, or he helped me hear, or he helped put people around me that could help me hear. I had never heard anything from God before. Plus, again, if we're going back to theology, I didn't think that was possible. I actually thought it was blasphemous, and there were really only a couple different times that I came close to leaving that program during that first year. And one of the times was because of this practice alone, this idea that God can speak directly to you.
Two-way journaling? Is that what you were doing?
Yeah. Yeah. So they do, at the time, they had a process or a practice baked into their process, which we could call two-way journaling, which is basically, it's very simple. It's you write your own thoughts and feelings, and then you ask God a question, and then you listen. Yeah. And then you write as if he's talking to you.
Yeah. Write it down.
That's as simple as it is. But you write it as if he's saying it to you. And that's a big difference, because I can write and then think about a spiritual question. This would be more maybe what I would do leading up to this is, I could write a journal entry, sure. And then if you want me to think about a spiritual answer, I could think about a spiritual answer. But I didn't feel very safe, just writing certain things that might have come into my heart or my mind, didn't know much of the difference between my heart and mind. And to write in the first person, to write in the third person, and as if God was speaking to me was just the weird, it was sacrilegious. Scary and sacrilegious. Yeah. But also scary. I mean, obviously I was scared, just didn't know it, but I just thought, this is blasphemous. This is sacrilegious. I'm not going to do this. I've been sober for 24 hours. And now you're wanting me to ask the God of the universe a question and then just wait as if he's going to answer, as if he's going to stop what he's doing and just say, sure. Okay. What's your question about? And okay. And he's going to speak in English. And he's going to speak in my version of English, right? Like none of this made a lick of sense. So they were generous enough. I pushed back on this harder than I think anybody else that was there at the time. And they were generous enough to let me use scriptures. I said, the only thing I'm comfortable doing is answering my question with scripture. So, you just do the whole flip through, stop, do that and write that down as if that's an answer, or draw upon what I knew memory. And be like, wait, should I stay in this program, God? And then what's that verse in 1 Peter maybe or something? It says, remain into the situation which you were called. And I'd be like, yeah, that sounds good. And I'd look it up, be like, yeah, there it is. Write that down. Boom, that's my answer. I should stay here. How do I know I should stay here? Because God already told Peter or Peter saying it to whatever church or whatever person. And so he's saying the same thing to me now.
Right.
But hearing him for the very first time, which, might take some explanation to some people, but hearing him for the first time has changed my life forever. And it's one of those experiences that I know can't be undone. Like I can't go back to before. And it's both comforting and also terrifying, right? Because it's almost too close for comfort. And it's like, so there's also no going back to the illusion that God is very far away, taking care of very serious business, right? Yeah. And it's my job to try to figure out boots on the ground, try to figure out how this thing's supposed to play out.
And as you begin to get in tune with his voice, because that's what they helped you do, is get in tune with the voice of God. And you give yourself permission to miss it, to make mistakes, but that's okay. You just keep going, keep asking, keep listening. As you got more and more in tune with the voice of God, what did you begin to learn about his character that you did not know?
Well, number one, just being relieved of the burden of thinking that the world is going to end is a great relief. It's such a great feeling. I can't describe it. I don't know too many people that felt it as deeply as I did, but I mean, I would get kicked out of events and kicked out of group activities and parties with my friends because I would just rant and rave about the signs of the times, right? I didn't go to college because I was convinced that it was ludicrous to go to college. The world will not last that long. There won't be another president after this one because I've worked out the math. And why would I want to be in debt? Why would I want to waste 4 years studying for something I won't ever be able to step into and be left with debt in the meantime? I mean, God forbid I have to go through some sort of tribulation and I have debt. That's the only thing worse than tribulation is tribulation with debt. So, and with a degree that I can't use, right? So anyway, that's how bad off I was. I just say that to stress. So the imminent impending doom of not only my own addiction and demise, which a lot of people feel an addiction is impending doom, but then also the impending doom of all of this kind of rapture theology and all this end time stuff. For that stuff to start to be relieved within about a month or two of being there. Number one, I mean, you don't have access to all that stuff, right? It's like a monastery. It really is like a monastery. Like there's no media. There's no books, there's no television, there's no movies, there's no outside contact whatsoever. There's no phone, there's no FaceTime, there's no nothing. If you want to communicate with somebody, you write them a letter and you put a stamp on it, right? And you put it in the mail. It's weird. And if
especially for the first 30 days or 60 days. Even.
First 60 days, no contact whatsoever. And then after that, just letters.
Yeah.
So still no phone after that, right? And for visitation for me, it was different because most of my family was up in Ohio. So, but anyway, some of the best things that happened to me early on. Number one, they were gracious enough to let me use scripture instead of trying to hear from God. I don't think I could have handled it. I think I would have ran away. So that took me about 4 months before that first moment where I said they helped me attune to the voice of God. And that voice of God was able to come through this conduit, right? And this conduit and onto the paper. And even then, though, I assumed that what would happen, the same with receiving the gifts, I assumed that it would be a trance state like I was used to, that you'd go out of your normal mind and body and something would take over and then you'd do that and then you'd look up and be like, who wrote this? That's not even my handwriting, So two things that I think really helped me at the beginning. One, they waited for me and they said, it's okay. Second, they took away my Bible. Best possible thing that ever could have happened to me for two reasons. One, it was my drug of choice, always has been.
Yeah.
Two, is my main mode of isolation and my main comfort and security. Is that I am getting better, doing better, becoming better because I'm absorbing these scriptures.
I had a similar experience that some people cannot understand. The Bible was my God. I didn't know it, but it was. I was taught to be a good soldier and be able to argue truth and all this. And I cut my teeth on a tulip,
Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, I had the 5 points of Calvinism down by the time at a pretty early age. And for a year and a half, God took the Bible away from me for a year and a half. And when I say he took it away, what I mean is when I picked it up to read it, to say it was dry is an understatement. It was painful. And in the beginning, I thought I was doing something wrong until I finally realized, he's doing this, right? He is stripping me of this idol of the Bible so he can give it back to me later. And now it's freedom and it's not bondage, because Paul said the letter will kill you, right? But the Spirit gives life, and that it was killing me. So a lot of people that don't understand that if they've never made the Bible an idol, they just can't understand why God would literally take it away. So that they were letting you use scripture to talk to God in the beginning, but then eventually they were wise enough to say, hey, let's put that book down.
Well, I think they realized that I was never going to actually listen to the voice of God with it there.
Okay.
Also, I was never going to come out of my room and get into relationships. I did when I absolutely had to. But the rest of the time, I would be in my room reading my Bible, which again, it served a dual purpose. One purpose is I didn't have to deal with other people, messy, humans. And then the second thing is it made me feel more righteous.
Yeah.
And I was getting more righteous as I went, So I think they saw all three of those things playing out: the isolation, the self-righteousness, and then just the crutch or the codependency on the Bible versus God, right? And they came and snatched it up, and that was the second time I almost left. Those were the two times. One was being told you have to write an answer as if God's talking to you right now on day one when I was high on cocaine yesterday. And the guy teaching me this, my quiet time partner, happened to be a gray-haired, ponytailed, toothless man who I won't name. And so I thought, this guy's obviously senile. And he's not even supposed to be here. Like, I don't even know what this guy's doing here. And so I had to go around and be like, is this for real? Like, are you guys serious about this? And they're like, yeah, you're going to be doing this every day. And you have to write an answer. That's the only thing. We don't even care what the answer is. You just have to write an answer as if it was from God. Just mind-blowing. It went against, it's almost like God found me a place that went against every religious bone in my body. But yet, again, was able to work through those, kind of like he eventually maybe used some of these more charismatic experiences to kind of get me out from under it. Kind of like what you said about, getting out from under the Bible, then you get the Bible back. You
get it back
in
freedom.
A beautiful way.
Yeah.
To where now the mystery is endless, right? It's endless, and it always glows and it always sings. And, I already know you cannot exhaust this mystery. But at the time, it was literally just, I already said heaping coals, but it was just shame on shame on shame on shame.
And you mentioned shame. Tell us what you learned about your identity there, because shame is an identity statement, right? Guilt is I did something wrong. Shame is I am something wrong.
Yeah, yeah.
So if anybody that's in addiction, I don't want to say everybody, but I would say in the 90% range of addicts, we struggle with shame.
Sure.
If not 100.
Sure.
So this is an identity type crisis. What did you learn about your identity?
Well, number one, you mentioned Tulip just a second ago. That first one, total depravity. I learned that real young. Real young. I said the prayer real young. I think I was between, let's say, 6 and 7 when I realized, hey, if there is this eternal place of torment, I don't care what it is, but you got to tell me what I got to do, And I remember my mom walking me through the salvation prayer, just a basic salvation prayer. And I remember my brother and I actually doing it, I think, at the same time. And I realized very quickly that I don't think that did anything. Like, I woke up the next morning just as afraid as before, if not more so, because now the formula that he gave me was just like, wait, I'm supposed to what? I just say some words and that's it? Like, I don't have to know what they mean. I don't have to, what does believing these things mean? What does it feel like, So, and then on top of that, I was very, like I said, I took it very seriously. So I wouldn't tune out at church on Sundays when I was young, growing up. I wouldn't tune out. I looked forward to it. And I would eat up everything that the pastor was saying, everything. And one of the things that the pastor was saying was that you are totally depraved, right? I mean, this is not a mystery here. It's not a secret. Like, every aspect of you is broken and flawed and really deplorable, like we're just wicked people. And if it weren't for just thank God for this substitute that came in, and I guess God was still so angry that I'm getting off. But that, when you say what's one thing that you learned about you, I learned that I'm not totally depraved. And this kind of takes us all the way back to the very beginning when I said that, show me an addict and I'll show you somebody looking for God. That I realized I had been looking and longing for God my entire life. And that also, I guess, another thing that I learned about me is that I was born with certain innate things, I'm sure, but that also there was all these formative factors. So I guess what I'm saying is this thing called I. You say, what did you learn about you? I learned that I am not just an I. That's one of the things I learned about me. And it might not sound that freeing at first, but I learned that I didn't just wake up and decide whatever I means, like, hey, self, let's be evil. Let's do evil. Let's pursue evil, right? Let's ruin other people's lives. Like, I didn't wake up thinking that. What happened was a series of injuries and wounds and traumas and lies and feedback loops, right? And core beliefs and collateral beliefs and I didn't really learn this about myself directly initially. I learned it about other people. So I would be there. Let's say I'm a few weeks in, and they would do this thing where they'd have a person get up and share their entire life story. Sometimes even map it out in the form of a genealogram, right? But just share their entire life story. And what was crazy is when you watch one of these things happen, you don't have to be a counselor. You don't have to be a psychologist. It all just makes sense. Yeah. Like you can look at somebody's formation and then look at them now and be like, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense.
Roots and fruits,
yeah,
maybe.
Yeah, really, you don't have to trace it back too far. These things are connected.
Yeah.
And they're not even connected in deeply mysterious ways. I mean, there's usually like a one-to-one relationship between a wound and the manifestation of that rotten fruit, let's say. But I saw this play out with many, many men in front of me because that was the nature of how they treated that first phase of the program. And so I would just watch person after person. And it's almost like anybody in the room, take a big, room full of really the scum of the earth, right? Just drug addicts who couldn't make it out with AA and couldn't make it out with a 30-day treatment and a 90-day treatment or whatever. They collect here in this year-long, like this is the last stop on the road.
Right.
And you could take that whole room after presenting a man's story and be like, now describe this person. And anyone in the room could easily describe it. And then, of course, that happened with me. I got up there and did my life story, and immediately people start giving me feedback on stuff that I'm just like, wait, how did you know that? I didn't even put that in the story. Or, just pointing out things that like, hey, how come you left all this stuff out of your story? I'd be like, I did. And then I'd go back through. And I realized that I'm not an expert on me, right? I am not the best person. I'm not qualified to even comment on what me means, So to me, it started to really, I know an easier, simpler answer to that question would have been just like an additive thing. Like what's the thing that came on top and just went boop and that changed the way you think about yourself. But for me, this was a very subtractive process and a very incremental subtractive process of, this thing that you think is you, it's not. Hey, this thing that you think you did, you didn't.
So it's the whole idea of self-revelation precedes divine revelation. Before I know who I am, I first have to realize who I thought I was, but I'm not. Right?
Yeah. Okay. And I'd say those two things, like we've talked about that phrase many times about self-revelation preceding divine revelation. I would say that divine revelation proceeds from self-revelation, meaning they happen simultaneously. It's almost like, as soon as something gets reconfigured about yourself, it also gets reconfigured about God in the same act, right? So it's not like you get this thing of self out of the way and then there's space and then you bring the God thing. It's being reconfigured simultaneously. So, I mean, to the point of, almost any detail that I could get into with my life, here's a good way to describe it. So I mentioned that I've written my life story twice in my life, my entire life story twice. Very worthwhile thing to do. Second time I've said that, maybe third. So anybody out there listening, highly recommend doing it just for your own sake. Write your own memoir. Do it now. Don't wait. It's very revelatory. But when I first wrote my life story, 21 years old at this year-long treatment center, thinking my life was over, by the way. I thought, I'm done. Not only was the world going to end anyway, but now my life is officially done. Like I've wasted all my potential. I was very suicidal leading up to this. But when I went back and wrote out my memories, that's what they told me to do. Write every single memory that you can recall. And if you can't recall it now, wait and we'll pray and we'll hope that you can. Write out every single memory. That would have been hard enough. But then at the end of each memory, they said, now in parentheses, choose 2 emotional words, right? That's where it got impossible. It's like I can say the thing, but then to actually have to identify 2 emotional words, they had to slide me one of those sheets, with the faces on them. Yeah. And I got that sheet, and I still to this day remember being like, what? What are some of these? Like betrayal is an emotion, Like I had no idea. So for me, attaching emotions to this was very revelatory. And I started noticing patterns of these emotions, right? And I started to notice, talking about roots and fruits, I started to notice things that I had done later that were attempts to relieve this emotion. But if I hadn't identified the emotion from before, I would not have connected those two things.
Right.
Or seeing opposite emotions, that like I was going after this because it provided the exact opposite from this. Yeah. But as I went through my life story, number one, it showed me that I have also been formed and I have contributed to that formation, but so have many others in my life, right? And then the second thing is that all of these pains were like completely available and accessible to me. Like they haunted me. They lived with me. These were my bedfellows. They were my internal dialogue. Like these wounds, these lies, these shames, these pains. It's about all that there was to me, right? I really didn't know much else but these things. I had never really experienced much else but these things. But now when I just did it over the past couple months, so much of that period leading up to No Longer Bound and that formative period, I couldn't connect with. I couldn't, because I guess the reason I got into that is this idea that as this concept of self and concept of God got reconfigured, again, it's almost like there's no going back.
Yeah,
and it changed everything about the way that I viewed my own life.
Yeah.
And so you mentioned the character of God earlier. I never really addressed it. It seems like to answer those questions is going to get into the most cliche sentences you could ever say about like going from a God who's angry, right? Who's perpetually hard to please or impossible to please, to a God that is perpetually or maybe approaching impossible to get him to reject me. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And
no matter how hard we try.
No matter what I do.
Yeah.
No matter what I do.
Yeah.
And those two modes of being are incommensurable. They cannot overlap.
That's right.
And they cannot fit together. And once one has started to form, again, it's like the seed that you can't stop from growing. And as it grows, the implications of it, as those start to expand, like again, you could take this thing called like a platitude, like God is unconditional agape. He's unconditional love. Okay, thanks, right? But if that starts to become true, and that starts to become the primary characteristic of God, not just a primary characteristic as if he's a person amongst other persons, right? He's the ground of all being, and it just so happens that the ground of all being is unconditional agape. It sustains the world, as Dante said, that the world literally turns on the love of God. But again, that platitude, that thing that could be written on a piece of paper 1,000 times, that I could write 1,000 times to try to convince myself that it's true, had to become experientially true.
Right.
And that lowercase t truth had to become the truth.
Yeah.
But for me, it was all about the experiential nature of this relationship and this revelation. That's what No Longer Bound literally was for me, and what I think it still is. It is a relational and experiential avenue into the heart of God. Yeah. And then you realize that, or then I realized that everything else that I thought I knew about God had nothing really to do with God. Right. I went to my interview there you have to sit through this pretty painful, pretty brutal interview process
to get into the program.
Yeah. And they said, do you believe the Bible? And I said, absolutely, I do. That's the one thing I can say, yes, I 100% believe, And then the guy looked at me and said, no, you don't. And I said, yes, I do. And he said, no, you don't. I said, yes, I do. Like what? I have it on me. What do you want to look up? Like, but the moving from intellectually affirming a set of propositions that I thought had to be affirmed so that I wouldn't burn in hell forever, and that maybe the quality of my life could also improve. But even if it didn't, even if it got worse, at least my eternal destination was secure, right? I never felt that secure.
Right.
I never felt that safety.
Yeah.
But B, I just realized that those propositions don't have anything to do with participating in the divine nature of God, right? They have nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
And that's where really, again, I thought I was going in so that I could sharpen my theology. And if I had little issues with it, I could build the house better, more stable on the rock, right? And what happened was just a series of deconstructions of my theology and confusions of my theology. And almost like God had no interest in theology whatsoever, to where, like, again, people that I started watching, men that should not have qualified, I started to watch God meet them, right? Like people that, like, unless you ascribe to certain details about the nature of the historic Jesus, you should not qualify to get God, right? God should not be talking to you, and he should not be telling you some of the things he's telling you. Like, you're mishearing, apparently, because you haven't gone through that narrow gate, right? But I started watching this unfold in front of me, and there was just no denying it. So the reason I wanted to say that is because for somebody like me, it had to be experiential. and the experiences had to defy the framework that I had crafted for myself, or that I had inherited. And as it started to demolish it, anyone who's gone through this process, disillusionment and doubt are not fun feelings at first.
Especially when certainty has been your God.
Certainty, I think, is the most powerful drug there is.
Sure.
I mean, I actually believe that to this day, that certainty is the most powerful drug there is. I said it twice just for effect, but I mean it.
Yeah.
Closure and certainty. I thought the Christian life was about closure, certainty, and answers to questions. That the primary role of Christianity is to answer my questions and give me certainty about them and closure. Whereas now, of course, I'm so far in the other ditch, I would say that the Christianity is awakening us to a mystery, and that God is not so much the object of our knowledge as he is the cause of our wonder and of our amazement and of this mystery. And obviously the word mystery, I would describe it like a Richard Rohr definition, where it's not something that's incomprehensible to us. It's something that's endlessly, infinitely intelligible to us, right?
One thing I love about God is that sometimes he will answer the questions and we will feel safety in an answer. And then sometimes he calls on us to get comfortable with the question and live in the tension, right? And it's you never know. You never know what question he's going to answer and what question he's not.
Sure.
And he's in total control of it all, and it's all love.
And it's almost like there's really, at the end of the day, there's only a couple questions that even matter. And it's like, because I agree with you that you can't live in total, you can't live so far out in insecurity, right? Like that you need a home, you need a safe home of security, and then you can venture out and fight battles and take risks and go on adventures and then come back, right? But that coming back, it's like, I really thought that there was a whole slew of doctrines that were important to hold on to. I mean, that's one of the main cautions, right? Throughout some of these epistles are like, be careful. There's a lot of false teaching out there, and know it when you see it. Like, be careful, be careful, be careful.
But all that false teaching was basically trying to present another simple Jesus, or trying to present a complicated Jesus when he was really simple.
Well, that could tie in exactly with what I'm saying. We could get into that historic stuff too, because I love talking about that stuff right now. But you're right that at the end of the day, if it's anything other than like these one or two questions, then don't worry about it. Or at least it can be teaching, but it's not. It's not your core. So for me, like, again, it's going to sound cliche, but to go through a year-long process just to discover what technically had been there from the beginning, and that God actually is better than you can imagine. He's not just better than you do imagine. He's better than you can possibly imagine. He's not just more good. He is goodness itself, right? Or that he is not just loving towards you at certain times of the week when he feels like it, or in certain situations where he's got an atoning sacrifice to kind of get in the way of you and him so he doesn't have to smell you as much. But like, no, he actually is unconditional love all the time. And anywhere that I've ever seen unconditional love, tasted it, found it in anyone else, that's him.
Scott, I think this is a pretty good stopping point. There's definitely going to be a part 2. Here's why. I think this is a perfect place to stop, because I know where your journey goes after this. And I know where my journey goes after this, and they're very similar, even though we've kind of ended up not in exactly the same place. You and I both have taken similar journeys after sobriety that I think it would be very beneficial for others to hear. So I can't wait for part 2, but thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for
sharing your story.
This is great.
Until next time.
Sounds good.
Nice.
See you soon.